December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest. The air is not just cold, it is heavy, with a freezing mist that clings to everything it touches. For the men on the front lines, the morning silence is broken only by the sound of shivering. A young private stands picket duty, encased in the standard issue wool serge greatcoat. It is a garment designed for the static trenches of the First World War, not the fluid, mechanized violence of the Second. Saturated by days of relentless sleet, the wool has become a freezing sponge, weighing nearly 15 pounds when wet. It locks his shoulders, restricts his aim, and saps his body heat, rather than preserving it. He is immobile, exhausted, and effectively paralyzed by his own gear. As the tree line erupts with the thunder of German artillery, he is already losing the battle for survival. Unaware that the key to enduring this white hell isn't a thicker blanket, but a thin, unassuming layer of pile fabric that was currently collecting dust in a rear echelon depot. To understand why a thin jacket liner became a matter of life and death, one must first look at the paralyzing legacy of American military tradition. In 1944, the United States Army was the most mechanized force in human history, possessing advanced tanks, semi-automatic rifles, and proximity fuses. Yet, when it came to clothing its soldiers, the Quartermaster Corps was still fighting the previous war. The philosophical foundation of the U.S. winter uniform was the overcoat, wool, roll collar. It was an imposing garment, elegant on the parade ground, but catastrophic in the field. Designed for the static realities of 1918, the greatcoat assumed a soldier would spend his time standing still in a dry trench. It operated on a simple, archaic principle. Weight equals warmth. The coat was made of dense Melton wool, gold buttons, and a long skirt that reached below the knees. In the dry cold of a training camp, it was adequate. But in the wet, muddy reality of European combat, it was a death trap. Once wet, the coat did not dry. It absorbed water, doubling in weight and turning into a freezing shroud that dragged through the mud, collecting ice and making silence impossible. A soldier running in a wet greatcoat was slow, loud, and an easy target. Underneath this behemoth, the average GI wore the M-1941 Field Jacket, a light, wind-resistant cotton poplin shell with a thin flannel lining. The M-1941 was comfortable and stylish, but it was flawed. It was too short, riding up the back when a soldier crawled, exposing the kidneys to the cold. More critically, its cotton shell offered zero water resistance. In the driving autumn rains of France, the M1941 soaked through in minutes, leaving the soldier with nothing but wet flannel against his skin. By the fall of 1944, the logistical calculus of the Allied High Command exacerbated these design failures. The prevailing mood in September was one of euphoria. German armies were retreating, and generals like Montgomery and Patton believed the war would be over by Christmas. Consequently, the colossal Red Ball Express supply trucks were prioritized to carry fuel and ammunition to sustain the offensive, rather than winter clothing. Millions of sets of modern gear sat in warehouses in England or the United States, deprioritized because the leadership believed the fighting would end before the snow fell. As the Allied advance stalled at the German border and the temperature began to drop, the American infantryman found himself trapped in a logistical gap. He was entering the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades, equipped with a summer jacket and a WWI trench coat. He was fighting a mobile war in clothing that punished movement. The stage was set not just for a battle against the Germans, but for a physiological collapse of the army itself. While the frontline soldier shivered in obsolete wool, A quiet revolution had already taken place in the laboratories of the Quartermaster Corps. Years of research into polar exploration and mountaineering had yielded a scientific breakthrough that contradicted centuries of military wisdom. Warmth comes from trapped air, not heavy fabric. This principle became the foundation of the M-1943 Field Ensemble, a layering system designed to replace every other uniform in the U.S. inventory. The crown jewel of this system was the M-1943 Field Jacket. Unlike the flimsy M-1941, the M43 was longer, covering the hips and vital organs. It was made of a heavy, windproof cotton sateen that was incredibly durable. But the jacket was merely a shell. The genius of the design lay hidden underneath. The system included a separate button-in jacket known as the liner jacket Field M1943. To the uninitiated, the liner looked unimpressive. A thin, olive-drab jacket that seemed too light to be effective, but the interior was lined with a dense pile of alpaca and mohair wool. This pile mimicked the fur of animals, creating thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped body heat against the skin while allowing moisture to escape. It weighed a fraction of the greatcoat's mass, but offered superior thermal retention. Crucially, it was modular. A soldier could wear the shell alone in the rain, the liner alone in the bivouac, or both together in freezing conditions. It was the birth of the modern concept of layering. However, having a superior design is meaningless if it cannot be delivered. General Robert Littlejohn, the chief quartermaster in the European theatre, was acutely aware of the impending disaster. He had fought tirelessly to get the M1943 system approved and manufactured. By the late autumn of 1944, millions of these liners and jackets had been produced. Yet they sat in stockpiles in the United Kingdom and at the massive bottlenecked ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp. The Allied supply lines were stretched to their breaking point. The Red Ball Express was consuming vast quantities of resources just to keep moving. Operational commanders faced a brutal choice. Every truckload of winter uniforms meant one less truckload of artillery shells or gasoline. In the gamble for a quick victory, the logistics of warmth were sacrificed for the logistics of firepower. The consequences of this gamble began to manifest as the rains turned to snow. The U.S. Army was effectively split into two classes. The lucky few in rear echelon units who managed to acquire the new M1943 gear, and the combat infantrymen at the sharp end of the spear, who were left to face the worst winter in Europe's recorded history, wrapped in waterlogged wool. The technology to save them existed, but it was hundreds of miles away, locked behind a wall of bureaucratic prioritization. As the barometer plummeted, the absence of that thin alpaca liner would soon be measured not in discomfort, but in amputations. The medical manuals classified it as immersion foot, a sterile clinical term that failed to capture the grotesque reality of the condition. For the men entrenched along the Siegfried Line, it was a slow, agonizing rot. It began with numbness, a welcome relief from the pain of the freezing slush, filling their boots. But as the circulation died, the skin turned a translucent, waxy gray, then blue, and finally black. When the boots were finally cut off, the smell of necrotic flesh filled the aid stations. This was not a wound from shrapnel or a bullet. It was a casualty of clothing. The standard issue leather combat boot, combined with the lack of water-resistant trousers, created a wicking effect. The heavy wool greatcoat, once soaked at the hem, acted like a wick, drawing freezing mud upward. A soldier sitting in a foxhole wasn't just cold, He was sitting in a suspended solution of freezing water. The body's response was to shunt blood away from the extremities to protect the core. Without the insulation of the M-1943 pile liner to retain that core heat, the body capitulated faster. Thousands of American soldiers were evacuated from the line without ever seeing a German soldier. They were defeated by the thermal conductivity of wet wool. Across the lines, the contrast was bitter and demoralizing. The German Wehrmacht, battered and outnumbered, held a distinct technological advantage in individual survival gear. Having learned brutal lessons during the catastrophic winter of 1941 on the Eastern Front, the Germans had revolutionized their winter clothing. They issued the Winteranzug, a heavy, reversible parka, and trouser set. One side was camouflage, the other pure white for snow concealment. Unlike the single-layer American greatcoat, the German parka was constructed on the very principle the U.S. Quartermaster Corps was struggling to implement: air insulation. It was a dual-layer rayon shell filled with wool batting or recycled felt. It was baggy, allowing for movement, and wind-resistant. American GIs, freezing in their restrictive coats, looked across the wire at an enemy that blended into the snow and moved with agility. The psychological impact was profound. The American soldier felt like an amateur, ill-equipped by a nation that boasted of its industrial might, while the defeated enemy seemed professional and prepared. This disparity drove American troops to desperate improvisation. Discipline regarding uniforms disintegrated as survival took priority. Soldiers discarded the heavy greatcoats, preferring to shiver in just their M-1941 jackets rather than be burdened by the wet weight of the wool. To compensate, they looted. A captured German parka became a prized possession, often worn with the camouflage side in to avoid friendly fire. Those who couldn't scavenge enemy gear turned to debris. They stuffed newspapers into their shirts and trousers to create dead airspace, a crude paper version of the M-1943 liner's function. They wrapped burlap gunny sacks around their boots and cut blankets into crude ponchos. The irony was stark. The wealthiest army in the world, backed by the greatest manufacturing engine in history, was fielding an infantry force that looked like a ragtag militia, swaddled in stolen blankets and newspapers, waiting for a supply shipment that had existed on paper for months. The tragedy of the situation lay in the fact that the solution was not theoretical. It was already boxed and crated. The liner, jacket, field, M-1943 was a triumph of textile engineering. Unlike the greatcoat, which relied on the brute mass of sheep's wool, the liner utilized a blend of alpaca and mohair pile on a cotton backing. This specific combination was chosen for its resilience. Sheep's wool, when compressed or wet, loses its loft, the fluffiness that traps air. Alpaca fibers, however, are hollow and stiffer. They resist compression. Even under the weight of a soldier's web gear or pack, the alpaca pile remained upright, maintaining that critical layer of dead air against the body. Furthermore, the liner was designed with slick sleeves to prevent friction. A soldier wearing the greatcoat fought his own clothing every time he raised his rifle. The thick wool bunched at the shoulders and elbows, altering his shooting stance and slowing his reaction time. The M-1943 liner, by contrast, moved with the body. It provided the thermal equivalent of the heavy coat, but with the mobility of a summer shirt. It was the difference between fighting in a suit of armor and fighting in athletic gear. But this engineering marvel ran headlong into the brick wall of Allied logistics. The broad front strategy, favored by General Eisenhower, required a ceaseless river of gasoline to keep the armored divisions moving. In the grand calculus of the war, a tank running out of fuel was considered a strategic failure. A soldier shivering in a foxhole was considered a regrettable but manageable condition. The supply depots in the communication zone were chaotic, overwhelmed by the volume of material arriving from the US. Cases of M-1943 uniforms were often buried under mountains of artillery shells, or mislabeled in the frantic push to the Rhine. In some sectors, rear echelon troops managed to acquire the new jackets and liners, wearing them comfortably in heated offices, while the infantry on the line froze. This maldistribution bred a deep, simmering resentment. The frontline soldier, seeing a fresh-faced driver in a warm, windproof M43, realized that the system hadn't just failed him. It had forgotten him. As December deepened, the strategic blindness of the High Command became fatal. They did not anticipate that the German army, master of winter warfare, was assembling an armored fist of over 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks just miles away in the mist. The Americans were about to face the greatest counteroffensive of the war, and they would do so while physically incapacitated by the cold. The Greatcoat, heavy and wet, was about to become a prison. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the Ardennes erupted. The German offensive smashed into the American lines under the cover of a Hitler weather front, a massive low-pressure system that grounded Allied aircraft and sent temperatures plummeting toward zero. For the American divisions caught in the path of the 6th Panzer Army, the battle was not just against Tiger tanks and Volksgrenadiers. It was a desperate struggle against a biological shutdown. The soldiers of the 106th and 99th Infantry Divisions were among those still primarily equipped with the M-1941 jackets and the archaic greatcoats. As the blizzard intensified, the moisture in their wool coats began to freeze solid. Soldiers reported that their coat skirts became like sheets of plywood, clattering against their frozen boots and making any attempt at stealth impossible. When they dove for cover, the coats did not bend. They snapped or remained rigid, exposing the soldier's torso to the wind. The physical exertion of combat only made the situation more lethal. A soldier carrying a bar or a heavy machine gun would sweat during a frantic retreat or a counterattack. In the wool-heavy system, that sweat was trapped. The moment the soldier stopped moving to hold a defensive position, the moisture cooled, and the chilling effect took hold. This was the precise moment where the missing M-1943 pile liner would have saved lives. The liner's ability to wick moisture and maintain loft would have kept the core temperature stable. Without it, the body's core temperature dropped into the danger zone of hypothermia within minutes of cessation of movement. In the besieged town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, found themselves surrounded and outgunned. They had been rushed to the front in open-topped trucks, many of the men still in their summer weight jumpsuits. The shortage of winter gear was so acute that the division's medics began reporting more casualties from the cold than from German 88 mm shells. Men were found frozen in their foxholes, their fingers so stiffened by the cold they could not pull the triggers of their M1 Garans. The thin jacket liner was no longer a matter of comfort. It was now the primary variable in the American Army's ability to maintain a functional firing line. By late December, the situation had reached a breaking point. The American High Command finally grasped that the cold weather crisis was threatening to dissolve entire regiments. In a frantic logistical pivot, the priority at the ports shifted. Ammunition was still vital, but general issue clothing moved to the top of the manifest. A massive aerial and ground effort began to push the M-1943 Field Ensemble and its life-saving pile liner toward the front. The arrival of the new gear in the Ardennes was described by many veterans as a religious experience. Supply sergeants worked through the night, tossing bundles of the new olive-drab jackets and liners to men as they sat in frozen craters. The transformation was instantaneous. Soldiers who had been shivering in heavy, soaked wool stripped off their greatcoats, literally throwing them into the mud, and donned the M-1943 system. The thin liner proved its worth in the crucible of the counter-offensive. Because the alpaca mohair pile did not collapse when wet, it provided a thermal barrier that functioned even in the slush. Soldiers found they could move with a speed and stealth that had been impossible a week prior. They could crawl through snow without the jacket riding up, and the windproof shell stopped the biting Ardennes wind from stripping away their body heat. The tactical flexibility of the liner changed the way the Americans fought. For the first time, a soldier could regulate his own temperature. During an assault, he wore the shell. When the unit dug in for the night, he buttoned in the liner. This modularity prevented the sweat and freeze cycle that had incapacitated thousands. The American infantryman was no longer a victim of his environment. He was equipped to master it. As the skies cleared and Patton's Third Army smashed through to Bastogne, the new U.S. Army was visible on the roads, sleek, mobile, and layered, leaving a trail of discarded frozen wool overcoats in its wake. The era of the greatcoat was dead, buried under the snows of the Ardennes by a superior understanding of human physiology. When the spring thaw finally arrived in 1945, the true cost of the clothing delay was laid bare in the hospital wards of Western Europe. Between November 1944 and March 1945, the U.S. Army suffered approximately 64,000 casualties due to cold weather injuries, predominantly trench foot and frostbite. This figure represented more than a tenth of the total casualties suffered in the entire European theatre of operations during that period. In many units, the number of men evacuated for frozen extremities equaled or exceeded those wounded by enemy fire. Medical reports highlighted a grim consistency. Soldiers equipped with the M-1943 Field Jacket and its pile liner were 50% less likely to be hospitalized for cold injuries than those in the old wool overcoats. The thin jacket liner was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a life-saving medical intervention that had been delivered months too late for thousands of men. The failure of the wool overcoat in the Ardennes signaled more than just a logistical error. It marked the end of an era in military doctrine. Following the German surrender, the U.S. Army officially retired the wool greatcoat as a primary combat garment. The success of the thin jacket liner birthed the modern extended cold weather clothing system. Designers realized that the key to survival was not a single massive barrier against the cold, but a series of thin, specialized layers. The M-1943 pile liner evolved into the M-1951, and then the iconic M-1965 Field Jacket liner, a quilted, lightweight piece that followed the exact same trapped air principle. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge were integrated into every conflict that followed, from the frozen ridges of Korea to the mountains of Afghanistan. The philosophy had changed from armoring the soldier against the cold to regulating the soldier's internal furnace. The history of warfare is often written in the movements of divisions and the innovations of ballistics. We remember the names of the generals and the calibers of the guns, but we rarely consider the humble weave of a jacket liner. Yet, The story of the M-1943 system reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of conflict. The greatest enemy is often not the one holding the rifle across the field, but the environment itself. The transition from the heavy wool greatcoat to the thin layered liner was a transition in the human understanding of resilience. It was a move away from the 19th century idea of enduring the cold through sheer mass toward a 20th century mastery of physics. It proved that a soldier's effectiveness is not merely a product of their courage or their training, but of their physiological preservation. Today, every hiker, mountaineer, and modern soldier who zips into a lightweight layered fleece is a beneficiary of the hard-learned lessons of the Ardennes. We no longer wear blankets, we wear air. We carry the legacy of the men who shivered in waterlogged wool so that future generations would never have to. The thin liner remains a testament to the fact that in the brutal theater of war, the most sophisticated technology isn't always something that explodes. Sometimes it is simply something that keeps you warm enough to keep fighting.